going to talk to you now about a 40-hour, 5-day course that we have taught really since 1995 on the evolution of intelligence from the Revolutionary War to the modern era. In the recent years, we've been asked by our clients to cut it into pieces, and so it's now divided into 9 4-hour modules, and I'll be summarizing them for you in this particular video. But first, by way of background, we started this particular class. It was called an overview of critical counterintelligence issues back in 1995. It was first previewed by a group of 47 instructors from all over the intelligence community. It was hosted at a foreign counterintelligence activity site operated by the U.S. Army, sponsored by the Army and the CIA. By 5 years later, we'd answered the question that everyone was asking themselves at the time this first class was given, and that is, could it be adapted to a class really on strategic intelligence for professionals inside the intelligence community? By the year 2000, Dave Major, who created the course as a part of a master's program at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., and I had delivered the course 72 times to well over 2,000 employees from the CIA, NSA, and other intelligence community professionals, as well as some federal and state law enforcement officers. So it's proved the test of time. Now, why did we do it? Why was the course created, and why was it offered to the intelligence community? Well, the real reason is because there was then no course like it on strategic counterintelligence. And as far as I know, there is not one yet today that looks at the 250 years of American intelligence, its successes, its failures, the lessons that we've learned over those years. It's a very intensive course. It is evolving all the time because we have new information based upon research, based upon new books, based upon events that are happening today that we add to it as we present it to new audiences. It really is an overview of strategy as well as some tactics, but mostly a high-level look at the strategy, the laws that have impacted the significant events that have occurred, and the major cases that have shaped U.S. intelligence and American history. And I have to add right now that when you look at the history of the United States, you very seldom are provided with an understanding of the impact that intelligence actually played on those big decisions and those leaders that made those big decisions over the 250 years or so that we've been a nation. An additional goal that we've always had for this course is hopefully a motivation for you to increase your own professional knowledge base, to develop your own insights and your own truths about the intelligence profession that you, in fact, are involved in, either as a professional or on the periphery of it, supporting intelligence professionals. Now, to give you an idea of someone else that thinks intelligence and the evolution of intelligence is important, here's a very short clip from President Obama delivered at NSA headquarters in January of 2014, where he talks about some of the things I'm going to go over with you in this particular video. Give it a listen, and we'll come back and add some more details to the contents of this, I think, very important series of modules on the evolution of intelligence in America.
At the dawn of our republic, a small secret surveillance committee born out of the Sons of Liberty was established in Boston. And the group's members included Paul Revere. At night, they would patrol the streets, reporting back any signs that the British were preparing raids against America's early patriots. Throughout American history, intelligence has helped secure our country and our freedoms. In the Civil War, Union balloons reconnaissance tracked the size of Confederate armies by counting the number of campfires. In World War II, code breakers gave us insights into Japanese war plans. And when Patton marched across Europe, intercepted communications helped save the lives of his troops. After the war, the rise of the Iron Curtain and nuclear weapons only increased the need for sustained intelligence gathering. And so, in the early days of the Cold War, President Truman created the National Security Agency, or NSA, to give us insights into the Soviet bloc and provide our leaders with information they needed to confront aggression and avert catastrophe.
The beginnings of intelligence in America really start with George Washington. He was obviously the first Army commander-in-chief. He's also the father of American codes and code breaking. He was our first president, the father of our country, no question, but he was also our first spy master. And to give that more credence, a former DCI, Bill Casey, said in 1983 that my first predecessor as Director of Central Intelligence was George Washington, who appointed himself, and that's exactly what Washington did. And I would also say to you that unlike any other commander-in-chief of the Army, and unlike any other president that we've ever had, Washington understood the value of intelligence, and he used his own money to create intelligence networks that assisted him in basically being successful as the commander of the Continental Army. Now, his job was never to beat the British. His job was to survive long enough, keep the army in the field long enough, that the British public got tired of the expenditure of resources and personnel to try to keep this American colony in its colonial status. He was never going to beat the British Army. They had the best army and for sure the best navy in the world at that time, but he needed to outlast them. And to do that, he absolutely needed to know what they were up to, where they were at, what their next plans were going to be. And he also needed to protect his own plans from the eyes of the British spies. And so in addition to his understanding and appreciation of intelligence, he also understood the importance of counterintelligence. A quote that we find in a letter that he wrote in March 27, 1776, he talks about the one evil I dread is their spies. And that's because he didn't want them to find out the poor condition of his troops, the numbers of the troops he had, the impact of the weather on his troops, the supply of his troops, which would have given them motivation to be far more aggressive than they ever were against his army. And so, both in the case of intelligence and counterintelligence, Washington appreciated their importance. One of the reasons for that is because during the French and Indian War, he was a major in the Virginia militia and was assigned to or accepted as an aide to a fairly famous British general, General Braddock, primarily famous because he is known more commonly as the guy in charge of Braddock's defeat. Near what's now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Braddock's superior force was met by an inferior French and Indian force, surprised, defeated, routed. He himself was killed. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him, all because he did not, that's Braddock, did not have intelligence on where the French were and what they were doing. And I think this was a keen motivator for Washington to be concerned during our Revolutionary War with the importance of intelligence. One of the British chiefs of intelligence, Major George Beckwith, talked about Washington not really beating the British or outfighting the British, which I've said already, but he outspied us, according to Major Braddock. And I don't think there's any doubt of that. The British had spies, but were very reluctant to emphasize espionage and intelligence, feeling that it was something beneath a British officer to get involved in that sort of thing. And so Washington had experiences in the past that made him see how important it was. He developed networks. He found people to work for him to manage those networks, and he did his own analysis. And that intelligence that was actionable, he developed plans to use it and productively protected his force, and sometimes was able to, like at the Battle of Trenton, inflict a defeat on the enemy as a result of the intelligence he had about conditions in Trenton. You can't talk about intelligence in the Revolutionary War and not talk about Benedict Arnold. Most people think that Benedict Arnold, in addition to being arguably General Washington's best battlefield general, is better known as America's first traitor. Not so. And we'll talk about in the module who America's first traitor was. Benedict Arnold was America's second traitor. But before he decided to commit treason against the Continental Army and the Continental Congress, he was known for several major battlefield successes at Fort Ticonderoga, battles on Lake Champlain, as well as the absolutely critical, perhaps the most critical battle of the Revolutionary War, the battle at Saratoga, because that's the battle that proved to the French that we could hold out against the British and cause them to be willing to support us with supplies as well as their navy and their army. So it was hugely important. Some people would say that it was his charge at Friedland's Redoubt that caused us to win that particular battle. Anyway, he was Washington's best battlefield general, but was disgruntled because he saw others that were not as successful or as competent as he was being promoted over him, and he decided to defect to the British. First, through written correspondence, and then on being discovered in a relationship that he had with a British spy master, a fellow by the name of Major Andre, having to flee his command at West Point down the Hudson River and board a British warship, HMS Vulture, and join the British. And eventually they promoted him to a brigadier general. He was involved in several battles later in the war in Virginia. Next spy that I'm going to talk to you about in the Revolution is one that we all know about, and that's Captain Nathan Hale. He was a fellow who should not have been a spy, and we go into some detail to describe how he was selected, the route that he took, the things that he did that made him noticeable to the population, and then his fairly rapid arrest and hanging. He had only been a spy for 6 days before he was hanged on September the 22nd, 1776, and this had an impact on the officers that knew him, I think an impact on General Washington. And when they did things after this, they did them in a more thoughtful manner. I won't say professional, because at this time there were no professional spies. Everybody was learning their job on the job, and it would be the same way in the Revolutionary War. But Captain Nathan Hale was maybe our best known unsuccessful spy. The best spies that Washington employed were the Samuel Culper ring of spies in and around Setauket, Long Island. And to create this particular ring, he turned to a dragoon major by the name of Benjamin Talmadge that grew up on Long Island. And Talmadge went on to get intelligence on what the British were doing in New York City on Long Island by putting together a network of people that he knew since his childhood. Friends that lived in and around Setauket, who made contact with people inside New York City, developed a ring and a way to get the intelligence out of New York City up across Long Island into Connecticut and then into Washington by courier. And the identities of those in this spy ring remained unknown for almost 150 years. They were not discovered really until the 1930s, when someone found in their attic a trunk full of documents that began to identify and show the importance of this particular spy ring. Fascinating story that we explore in some depth in this module. So there's some things I could say to you about what spies were like in the Revolution. First of all, they were volunteers and they were amateurs. There was counterintelligence of a sort. The basic public awareness program was spies are afoot in the land, the so-called hue and cry. There were deserters and defectors and traitors that became spies for the other side. Scouts and couriers were used to collect intelligence. Non-official covers and covers for action were used. Diplomatic intelligence was collected, and there were diplomats who did that type of collection, including Benjamin Franklin. And all of these things make the story of intelligence during the Revolution much more comprehensive than most people thought it might be. And this module, for me, is one of my favorite modules. The War of 1812, and really the period between the Revolution and the Civil War, not much intelligence was done at all. Those networks that were in place during the Revolution were disbanded. The federal government had no civilian intelligence service. The military and the Navy were reduced to very small numbers of troops and vessels. And really, the only intelligence that was collected of any value in the War of 1812 against the British was collected by the troops in the field, the commanders in the field, by cavalry and through their binoculars. A very rudimentary intelligence collection that had been going on literally for centuries. The Civil War was, from an intelligence point of view, very much like the Revolutionary War. As the Civil War progresses, commanders, including those commanders on both sides and President Lincoln, recognized the need for intelligence. But there were some problems, and everything had to be put together as it had been during the Revolution as they went along in their respective positions and responsibilities. There were no professionals in the beginning. Just like in the Revolutionary War, they were amateurs and volunteers. There was no central national organization on either side for intelligence, no coordination of effort. The intelligence that was done was duplicated frequently. Little of it was shared, and a lot of it was lost because it did not get to the user fast enough. It was actionable, but it took so long to get there that the events had changed and it could not be used. Intelligence sources similar to the ones during the Revolutionary War. Some new, though. Photographers and photography is new. Deserters, prisoners of war, yes. Newspapers, this is new. Not much from newspapers were used during the Revolutionary War. Hot air balloons is new, and telegraphs is new. So there's some new technologies here that weren't there before. But by far, I think the most important point to make to you is that women and slaves were very successful, and primarily on the Union side, women, and exclusively on the Union side, slaves were successful in being able to get intelligence and get it back to Union commanders in time to use it. Some other points. Washington, remember, was a Southern city. When Southern sympathizers, Southern officers in the Army and the Navy went south, they left stay-behind agents that they had recruited inside Washington, D.C. Many Southern sympathizers lived in Washington, D.C. throughout the war and afterwards. And some of them were employed by the Department of the Navy, the War Department, the State Department. And the last thing I would say is that the Union created two rival counterintelligence agencies, which was not helpful in catching spies, although several of them were certainly caught. Most Civil War spies were amateurs. There are over 400 spies in the research that I've done and the books that I've read that worked for both sides during the war. These men and women were generally amateurs, but they were passionate volunteers as well. The few professionals that there were are generally men, one or two women, that had been police or private detectives working for the Pinkerton Agency mostly. Now, the thing that I said to you earlier that I want to emphasize and repeat is that the Confederacy overlooked the espionage threats from women and slaves, thinking both groups were not intelligent enough to understand the military discussions that they were allowed to overhear. The best Union spy was Elizabeth Van Lew in Richmond, a fascinating woman that was an abolitionist and used her freed slaves to basically populate her intelligence network and use them as couriers to get the intelligence that she and her network created to the Union Army. The best Southern spy was Rose Greenough, who was a socialite in Washington, D.C., that was very successful in collecting intelligence up to the time that she was discovered by Alan Pinkerton and his detective agency. The two rival counter-spy, counter-espionage organizations were run by Alan Pinkerton, the second one by Lafayette Baker, who in his book takes credit for creating the U.S. Secret Service, but he did not do that. All right, after the war, what happens? Well, intelligence goes away in the Army the way that it did after the Revolutionary War, but some things are going to happen during this period that are important for us to keep in mind. The first of all is the Secret Service. Secret Service stands up in 1865, primarily as a federal criminal investigative agency to go after counterfeiters because the Union started using paper currency that was being counterfeited, and the law finally made its way through Congress, establishing them. It was one of the last official acts that President Lincoln did before he was assassinated. It was put under the Treasury Department. It was not involved in protecting President Lincoln. The Metropolitan Police Department did that, and off and on involved in some protection of presidents when specific threats were discovered, but did not become the official 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365 days a year protection for the President of the United States until William McKinley is assassinated in 1902. During World War I, the Secret Service is going to be involved in investigating German espionage in Washington, D.C. and in New York, but that's only going to be during a short period of time, probably from about 1915 to 1918. Three other agencies that have an impact on federal intelligence collection and law enforcement are created during this time. The Judiciary Act of 1879 creates the Office of the Attorney General, and it took really almost 80 years before there was more than one person, that is the Attorney General, doing the job part-time. By 1870, during the Grant administration, the Department of Justice is stood up to support the activities of the Attorney General, but without any investigators until 1908. Next organization I want to talk to you about is the Office of Naval Intelligence, which really is the first of the military intelligence services that still exist today. It was created on orders of the Secretary of the Navy in March of 1882 and had certain limited requirements to collect information on foreign navies and foreign ports in its initial mandate. 3 years later, 1885, the Secretary of War says the Army needs to have an intelligence service and stands up the Division of Military Information that's later going to be renamed to the Military Intelligence Division, and is going to do the same sort of thing for the Army that the ONI is going to do for the Navy. And both of them are going to start out very, very slowly and going to be very, very lightly staffed. I think the Army starts out with one officer and 3 clerks, something like that, until we get into World War I in 1916, and then it mushrooms dramatically in size. The last of these federal intelligence agencies that I'm going to talk to you about starts up, like the U.S. Secret Services, exclusively a criminal organization. In 1908, President Roosevelt pushed the Attorney General, Charles Bonaparte, to create inside the Department of Justice a group of investigators because Justice had been barring investigators. It hired people from the Pinkertons and used Secret Service agents as investigators, but didn't have their own. The AG did that. He created what was known as the Bureau of Investigation, the BI, and focused them exclusively on a small number of criminal violations that would allow these investigators to collect evidence to assist attorneys inside the Department of Justice in prosecuting cases. Very little counterintelligence is even considered by the BI until World War I is well underway. By 1935, because of a crime wave that we'll look at a little bit later on in this video, the BI is renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the same organization, just given a different name, but more particularly given expanded authority to carry weapons, to make arrests, and to become really a national federal law enforcement agency. World War I begins for the rest of the world on August 1st, 1914, really with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. At the time the war starts, the United States doesn't have a dominant army or navy. We didn't have a foreign intelligence service. We have almost no intelligence on any of the belligerents. The Secret Service is hamstrung and can only focus on criminal investigations inside their charter, mostly counterfeiting. The BI, the Bureau of Investigation, is only doing criminal investigations, and the State Department collects a small amount of diplomatic intelligence, but nothing of any real significance or substance. On the other side of the coin, the Germans recognize the incredible potential, industrial potential the United States has, and want to keep our goods out of the hands of their enemies, the French and the British. And so they mount a massive espionage and sabotage campaign inside the United States. As you're looking at this particular slide, I'm not going to read it for you, but they sunk a significant number of ships carrying those munitions of war from U.S. ports to the British and the French. They bombed plants in the United States. None of this really is in any of the high school or college history courses you or I ever took. I've gotten these statistics out of a book written in 1937 by Captain Henry Landau called The Enemy Within. And as time goes by, more research is being done, and these numbers are coming into better focus. But they certainly are significant, particularly significant when I consider the fact that I never heard about any of this stuff as I was taking those classes in high school and college. The biggest sabotage attack that I never heard of, and you never heard of, is the bombing of Black Tom Island. You probably never heard of Black Tom Island either. It was an island shaped like a cat in New York Harbor, and thus it gets its name. It was set across on the Jersey shore from the Statue of Liberty. The bombing took place on the 30th of July, 1916. And before that evening was over, more than 2 million pounds of explosives had erupted in the largest man-made explosion the world would see up until the time that Hiroshima was bombed. The cost of the damage at the time was $20 million. In 2023 dollars, that's $580 million. Remarkably, only 7 people were killed, but it did increase the amount of fear inside the U.S. population, causing significant terror and the belief among the American people that its government could not protect them from this kind of attack. The next module really focuses on the interwar years between World War I and World War II. We look at a number of different espionage threats and a significant criminal threat that causes a change in the structure of and the resourcing of the FBI. And this is the gangster era of the late 1920s and 1930s, the Lindbergh kidnapping, the Kansas City massacre, the bank robbers that were crossing county and state lines to avoid police departments that could not do that did not have jurisdiction outside of their home territory. Some of the names that I've included here you'll recognize from history. The reaction by the public caused Congress and the executive branch to do a number of things. Congress wrote new law, created greater appropriations for the Bureau of Investigation, law that allowed the Bureau of Investigation to carry weapons, become a national police force, and change the name from the Bureau of Investigation to now the organization that you know as the FBI or the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Same outfit, but with new jurisdiction, with new resources, and with new capabilities. And one of the things that they began to do that they had not done since World War I was start to look at the espionage threat to the United States. And one of the biggest ones at that particular time was German espionage. A lot of German spies in the United States. And the FBI was able to mount operations and basically take all of them off the table before we enter the war on December 7th, 1941. Now, the war is already going from the 7th of September, 1939, but we're not going to enter it until a couple of years later. Two of the cases that I want to point out to you, there are several others in this particular module. The module itself is 4 hours long, but the first espionage double agent case that the Bureau ever ran is called the Siebel-Duquesne case, and it resulted in the arrest of 33 German spies during June of 1941 before we ever go to war with Germany. So Germany, by the time they declare war on us after Pearl Harbor, has no eyes inside the United States to collect intelligence as a result of this and several other counterintelligence coups. The other case involves an effort by the Germans to reestablish their networks in the United States called Operation Pastorius. And it sees in June of 1942 the landing in 2 locations of German spies / saboteurs, 8 of them, 4 are going to land in Amagansett Bay off Long Island. The second group is going to land in Florida at Punta Vedra. Both groups take off their German uniforms, don civilian clothing, bury all their espionage and sabotage materials in the sand to come back to it. In a very short order, the 8 are arrested. By August the 8th, they'd all been tried and convicted and sentenced to death, and 6 of them on August the 8th were executed in an electric chair in the D.C. jail and buried in unmarked graves in the District of Columbia. The other 2 had life sentences that were eventually commuted and deported back to Germany in the late 1940s. The second of the espionage threats involves Japanese intelligence during the period 1925 to 1945. And there were a number of different Japanese intelligence agents that they recruited. There were some of their naval intelligence officers sent here under the cover of being students, English language students at universities on the East Coast and West Coast of the United States. The biggest network by far is Lieutenant Commander Itaru Tachibana's network that was neutralized in June of 1941. Arguably a dozen or so spies in this network, and very effective in collecting intelligence. When he was arrested, his hotel room was searched, and the FBI and Naval Intelligence found evidence of this ring and massive amounts of national defense information that this ring had collected. One of the points we make in this module is that World War II was a SIGINT and a covert operations war. Tremendous successes in signals intelligence and code breaking, as well as creation of covert organizations like the OSS to go behind enemy lines, taking a page from the British Special Operations book of their SOE, Special Operations Executive. The OSS put undercover operatives into European countries as well as countries in Asia, and was successful in supplying and training guerrilla groups there to attack the Nazis and the Japanese. But really, more importantly, World War II was a SIGINT war, and these are some of the major successes in the SIGINT business that the Army and the Navy code breakers were able to achieve. First, the Diplomatic Purple Code, which allowed us for the entire period of the war to look inside Japanese diplomatic traffic to understand what was happening, not just with their diplomats, but with their Army and Navy as well. In 1942, the Navy broke JN 25, the Japanese Naval Code, which assisted in understanding where Japanese fleet units were moving to. The Customs and Navy personnel in San Francisco in 1940 stole the Japanese code book that gave them information on Japanese merchant codes. And then in 1942, breaks of JN 152 and JN 167 allowed for our code breakers to see every day at noon where every single one of the Japanese ships was at in the world, and therefore allow us to direct our submarine force to intercept them and be very successful in taking out numerous Japanese ships. Finally, the last of our modules considers the evolution of intelligence from the Cold War to the War on Terror. And this is really a story of a fast start with lots of early successes in intelligence collection and covert action, followed by extraordinary intelligence failures and really the dysfunction of the concept of covert action. There was, as a result of these failures, a loss of trust by the national command structure, the media, and the public, loss of congressional support, which included funding, and then coming back from those failures took an awfully long time to win back the respect for the U.S. intelligence community. So this is a very interesting period in our history that we cover in really 2 4-hour modules. Now, we're going to look at the beginning of this period, the beginning of the Cold War, which starts at the end of World War II, with most Americans, including President Truman, believing that we would remain allies of the Soviet Union. But that didn't happen because the Soviets kept their Red Army stationed in the Eastern European countries that they had conquered during the war itself, and they escalated their conflict, mostly through their intelligence services, the KGB and the GRU, with the United States and our allies around the world. This new Cold War, non-shooting war, was the result of these actions by the Soviet Union. It's during this period that we have a number of Soviet defectors come to us, come to our Canadian and British allies, as well as a Army Signal Security Agency, the forerunner of NSA, and their program to break into Soviet codes called Venona are going to start to educate us on the incredible size and scope of the Soviet penetration of Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In the final analysis, the Venona program, which I would argue is the most important counterintelligence source of the 20th century, will point out a penetration by more than 400 codenamed Soviet recruited agents inside our government institutions and American companies, which is a massive penetration by anyone's standard. Another one of the major components of this particular module is a detailed look at the impact of the Watergate break-in and its role in the resignation of President Nixon and the follow-up increase of controlling legislation, federal statutes, to control U.S. intelligence community agencies. This all gets started with a group of investigators inside the White House called the Plumbers, who were looking for leakers in the Nixon administration as the Nixon administration began to ramp up its efforts for the 1972 national presidential election. The Plumbers were repurposed to campaign dirty tricks, and one of those dirty tricks was the burglary of the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate complex in D.C. In June of 1972, 5 of the Plumbers were in the process of going through the Democratic National Committee offices to collect intelligence as well as to plant bugs in the telephones in those offices when they were arrested by the D.C. Metro Police Department. In the ensuing investigations by both the FBI as well as the Washington Metro Police Department, as well as Congress, the Nixon administration was gradually put under increasing pressure, and finally the president was forced to resign. The last part of this particular story, we focus on the laws that were put on the books and the governmental agency regulations that were enacted to attempt to get the U.S. intelligence community under some better control to ensure that this sort of thing did not happen again. As we get closer to the modern era, this particular module will change its focus and look at the intelligence-driven effort to identify the location for Osama bin Laden, which was pinpointed as Abbottabad, Pakistan, and the follow-on mission by U.S. Navy SEAL Team 6 on May the 2nd, 2011, to locate and kill bin Laden at that compound in Abbottabad. March of 2019, the next one of the major events is going to take place that we focus on, and that's the effort to take out ISIS and reduce its caliphate, and that happens while ISIS itself is not destroyed. The caliphate is, in fact, neutralized. In August of 2021, after 20 years, the U.S. withdraws from Afghanistan in disarray. And then on the 24th of February 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. The last event that we'll be talking about in this module, of course, things could change, and things will be added as they do change, is the October 7th, 2023 attack by Hamas in Israel. In this module, we'll explore also the fact that we're moving away from a war on terrorism world and perhaps returning to a world that we knew during the Cold War so well for so long, and that's a world of great power competition. By way of some final comments, to give you a sense of what I think is the importance of these now 9 modules that look at the events that shaped U.S. intelligence. The first thing I would want to say again is that we've been doing intelligence and counterintelligence for more than 250 years. It's not something that's come on the scene in the last 50 or 100 years. There is a long continuum of experiences we've had. And when I took the first course in 1995 that I mentioned to you at the beginning of this video, I was amazed to find out how many things I did not know about intelligence and counterintelligence, but most particularly, it was remarkable for me to understand the fact that I belonged to a profession that had such a rich and diverse and successful past. 250 years is something that this particular course focuses on in some detail to give you an understanding of what role intelligence has played over those years. The only thing new in the intelligence and counterintelligence business is the technology now available to carry out intelligence and counterespionage operations. The tradecraft is the same. The types of spies are the same. In many cases, the types of spies have been around for 26 centuries, since really the time of Sun Tzu. In the Ping Fa, he talks about 5 types of spies, and you can identify every one of them in espionage today. Nations don't have friends, they have interests. It's important to keep in mind. Can have a nation that's an ally, but that does not mean that nation will not be collecting intelligence on you to try to determine where you're going, particularly in the arena of economic intelligence. And that's driven by, in some cases, national interests, but it's most often driven by company or corporation profit interests. There are no more important professions than intelligence, counterintelligence, and counterterrorism, and security. I didn't say that they're most important, but there are none that are more important. I'm going to give you an idea of why I say that every commander, every agency chief, and every CEO needs to know the threat that's posed by their adversaries and competitors. Now, what do you get from intelligence and counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and security? It's not an option. Intelligence is not an option in any one of those categories of leaders that I just described. You get from intelligence a protected environment where we ourselves and our most important creations, ideas, can flourish. If someone gets inside that protected environment, they're going to steal our ideas, our intellectual property, our classified information, and use them for their interest or against our interest. And therefore, as important as it is to create some new product or create some new classified project, the person that creates that project, the intellect that creates it, is no more important than the person that's involved in protecting it. Because if someone steals it, doesn't matter how bright you are, it doesn't matter how much money you spent on the product, you've in fact lost it. So that's a look at our 9-module series on the events that shaped U.S. intelligence. Thanks for listening.